We're talking today with Belsem Aljobry, who's in London right now, and she's also a student at GW, hoping to finish up there. But there's one thing that I notice: any conversation with Belsem Aljobry always has the names of several countries in it. So we're talking before this podcast, and Zambia pops up for some reason. But right now she's in London. So Belsem, let me just begin by asking you a direct question. Okay. You've been to all these places, you've got roots all over the world. Where is home?
Home. That's a nuanced question with many different answers. I've lived in, different states, different countries, but I think home, I found it to be anywhere my mom is. I was raised primarily by a single mother, so whether that's Jordan or Philadelphia, or we lived in Texas, Chicago, I think wherever she is, I feel most comforted and full.
Okay. And where is she now?
Philadelphia, and
Okay.
she'll
All right.
she'll be in Pakistan, so I might have to follow her there.
Okay. So you've been in Jordan, you've been in Pakistan. We've talked about where your home is, where your mom is. Where are your roots? Where are you from?
My roots. So I come from a Iraqi Shia father and a second generation immigrant Pakistani mother who's Sunni. My family has roots all over. So my brother married a Spaniard, my cousins are half German, my other cousins are half Irish, half Pakistani. So I've, been blessed with the opportunity to feel like a lot of places are I have a connection to, right? But I think that at the very base of it would be Pakistan and Iraq.
Okay. But the language is English when your family gets together, right? That's the one language everybody shares?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay. And you're going to be a senior next year at George Washington University. You will come back to us to DC by way of other places, but you've got a special interest in girls' education. Is that right?
I do, yes.
Okay. Where does that come from?
That comes from just like, my, answer with home. So being raised, by a single mother, seeing how empowered she was to make decisions by herself, guided by her education, her experiences, also being, fortunate enough to travel a lot of the world, that she did alone, right? So she traveled to, parts of Asia and Africa and Europe as a woman by herself, and I think that's given her a lot of courage to be able to make decisions for herself and also me, her daughter. So it all started when I first went to Pakistan many, many years ago, and I had pushed to go because I felt like truly didn't feel that much of a connection. Being that it was my grandfather and my grandmother who immigrated to the US, a lot of my Pakistani side has lost their connection to the identity, the language, and the culture, as well as the religion. So I felt kind of imperative to feel connected to at least one of these sides, either Iraqi or Pakistani. So I asked my mom to go to Pakistan, and she hadn't been in over a few decades. So we went, and she was kind of almost learning the ropes just like I was. Well, she spoke the language though, so that kind of helped. And when I saw a lot of girls that kind of resembled me sitting, you know, content with their circumstances, but so void of opportunities, right? I was astounded. I thought I would coming was coming from this super knowledgeable background. I said I've traveled, to Italy, and I lived in Jordan. I thought I knew what the world was like until I truly saw the lived realities of many, many girls. And so returning back to the US, I was confronted with the amount of privilege I've had to not know that that was a reality. So I started looking into statistics and started asking questions. And I talked to my mom about the feasibility of potentially, doing something about it. And my answer was I didn't really know what I wanted to do about it, but I knew I wanted to do something. And so through this long process of research and asking questions and sitting down and, again, confronting my bias and confronting my privilege, I've been able to, have some success in changing, the pathways for these girls.
Okay, tell us a little bit about that. So you went to Pakistan with your mother. Have you ever been back since then?
I have. I've been back, 3 times since. The first time after the initial, trip was around, I think, so about 4 years later, I went back, and that was got with questions that I had reviewed, by ethics board, through a professor that I met through just cold emailing all these different university professors when I was in high school, because my high school teachers told me we're not really equipped for this type of, research and stuff like that. So once I went to Pakistan, I started asking questions from university professors, from curriculum coordinators that had worked on curriculums in the government. National, it's called the Single National Curriculum, was a big program at the time that was, being developed. And then I went back again and I started scoping out then the areas for what I could do. So whether or not it meant helping out an existing school with funds and or donations like books or supplies, or actually establishing my own school. Then I came back, and then the third time, or technically the fourth time, is when we got boots on the ground and started to like create the school itself.
Creating a school while
Yes.
you're still in school.
Yes.
That's ambitious.
Yes, it is, and it's definitely not been easy. It's not, I mean, I'm painting it out to be this kind of streamlined process, but when you're dealing with Pakistan, and I unfortunately do not know or do as well as my mother, it was tough because I felt like I was being misled by a lot of natives, for, selfish reasons, for corruption and things like that. So, it was definitely not as streamlined as, I tell you now, right? But I think that I'm very happy that we have a kind of successful end.
So you used an interesting word just now. You were misled by natives, right? And your Pakistani extraction. Tell us a little bit about what it's like going to Pakistan, Pakistani ancestry, raised by a Pakistani mother, but never having been to the place and not speaking the language.
Yeah, it's funny, I think if there's one word to put it. When I stay at, hotels, or when I see my family, they to to be quite frank, are more interested in my Iraqi side. I think that's because they're so used to all the different Pakistanis around them that they're more curious as to how, Arabic has affected my life or my living in the Middle East and things of that sort. Why I haven't been back to Iraq yet, and I'm like, it's pending. I do wanna go. But I also think the way I look paints the way that I'm treated a lot. So when I'm in areas, I've has been asked many, many times if I was liking Pakistan and things like that, if they thought I was some type of celebrity, just because they didn't think that I looked Pakistani at all. And they were like, "What is this girl doing here?" And so I felt a bit disconnected from even my own family, my second and third cousins, just because they didn't really seem as interested in the fact that I was Pakistani and joining in with that side rather than me being more Iraqi and American. So it's been interesting. And a funny story, another story is that of them painting more attention to the Iraqi side was I was in the north area of Pakistan, near the kind of Afghan border, and there's a there's a event in Islam and Shia Islam called Muharram where they celebrate, or not celebrate, sorry, they mourn the death of one of our prophet's grandchildren. And when I first saw them, I was, like, dumbfounded. They just had these scarves tied around, and they were holding these AK-47s, right? And they were in this back of this. I was like, "Okay, like, this is the end for me," right? I was like, I had no experience with what was happening. I obviously knew Muharram because my dad was Shia, but I didn't know, this type of, demonstration. I remember my driver stopped us in this village where it was just, a lot of these rituals that I personally don't believe in, and my dad doesn't either, because I think it's a lot of, a bit of extremism, to be honest. But my driver told him, "Oh, she's Iraqi," which is kind of the birthplace for Shia Islam, and where, these, descendants had passed or had been killed, right? And so I remember I had to go to everyone's house, and they're, like, loving that I was Iraqi. They completely forgot I was half Pakistani. They just wanted to hear the fact that, "Okay, where in Iraq is your dad from? Oh, have he's been to Najaf? Has he been to Karbala?" Which are these holy pilgrimage sites. And so I thought that was another interesting case of them, of another group of Pakistanis not necessarily being as interested that I am Pakistani.
Well, you're also, besides being Iraqi and Pakistani, you're both Sunni and Shia, and both Iraq and Pakistan are places where there has been communal tension in recent years. What's it like being both in, well, we're not going to talk about Iraq because you haven't been there, but in Pakistan?
It's tough. It's tough. I feel as though I grew into the religion of Islam. My cousins are all Christian, both Catholic and Protestant. I grew up in a predominantly Jewish area. I wanted a bat mitzvah growing up rather than, celebrating Eid. But I remember, having Easter egg hunts with my cousins, and the mosque that I went to was Sufi. So it was really interesting because I was never super connected to either Sunnis or Shia because I felt like I didn't even know the very basis of the religion to start off with. When I started learning about Islam, it was through friends, and they're predominantly Sunni. So my understanding of Islam was very skewed in that perspective. And I have noticed with a lot of Arabs specifically, but also a lot of Pakistani, this religious almost they look down upon Shias because they feel as though it's not the correct way to follow the religion, and some people even chalk it up to them not being Muslim, right? One thing, I mean, Pakistan has so many great things about it and a lot of bad things as well. And one of the very bad things is that religious tension. There's a lot of, attacks on the Shia community, both in the north, but also I've seen, larger cities and things like that. And so it's a bit disheartening seeing that given the fact that, it's still the same religion at the end of the day. So that's very tough. I think sometimes I feel as though I have to be a chameleon, right? I'm like, yep, I'm Sunni here, but then it's like, up north, well, they heard I was Iraqi. I'm like, I'm Shia all the way through, So I believe it's the same religion at the end of the day. So
Well,
whatever.
yeah, forgive my ignorance, but when you pray, Sunnis and Shia pray slightly differently,
They
right? So
do.
in a sense, you have to make a choice. You
Yeah,
can't be both at the same time, right? So,
that's
so
true.
how do you handle that?
I haven't really seen, like, anyone watch me pray or anything like that, but I do pray the Sunni way just because that was the way I was taught. So with the hands folded, I don't pray on the or even though that's originally what Islam says is to pray on the ground of the earth and things, I just find it to be easier. I try to, take the most simple part of the religion.
And do you talk about your attitude towards religion growing up? I mean, in these places where religion kind of defines community, and then you're coming from a place where you say, even within your family, you've got all kinds of religious differences.
Right. For sure. My stepdad, unfortunately, he passed away, was Hindu growing up, so we had also Krishna in our living room, right? I mean, it was just a plethora of different cultures and religions I grew up with, and honestly, I feel blessed for it because ended up learning so much about little bits and pieces of these religions, and I think the very like person who's inspired me to learn more was my grandfather. Right before he passed, I remember he would have these little phases of when he was super into Buddhism or when he was super into, Christianity, right? And right before he passed away, he was super into Hinduism. And obviously, that's pretty crazy because that's the reason why Pakistan and India split was this idea that like the Hindus and the Muslims need to stay separated. And so I remember thinking, wow, I mean, he was so open minded that that's something I took with me to Pakistan. I remember I was talking to a few girls at my school, and obviously this was being translated, but I was like, "One of my best friends is Hindu, and he's an Indian," and they just couldn't believe it, and they're like, and you guys don't like, how come that's even possible, right? Because of this nationalism that's been pushed within Pakistan, and I was showing photos of us, at school together, and how he was helping me carry the books for them, and packing them into my luggage, and they were just, amazed by that, and I think it's, like, conversations like those can start bridging connections more than create divides, because I think that, like, of course, there's always gonna be topics and conversations that are taboo, but we shouldn't just avoid them altogether, and so I feel like that's been my biggest approach when it comes to religion is and cultures as well, listening to the other side and finding connections, I'm like, in India, they also do this in Pakistan, or, when I'll talk to a Christian and I'm like, in Islam, we also do this," so yeah. Another thing I just found out recently, before my grandfather passed away was, I believe it's Orthodox Jews also, like, for 40 days or, like, I think it's like a year, they don't celebrate or, like, host any, like, celebrations after someone passes, and it's very similarly in the Middle East and Islam too. So I found that to be a really nice connection.
Yeah, there are these parallels. What's interesting, I'll just tell you one thing that's interesting to me when I hear you talk about these. It's not just that you combine all these different identities in your family and even in your person. It's how you talk about them. The emphasis is on what's going on within you, how you negotiate them, or how you kind of interact with people. It's not how you're seen or how things are imposed. That comes up, but only in passing. And I'm thinking somebody with your background going into these different locations is going to people are going to wonder, is she Sunni or is she Shi? She claims to be a Muslim, but she doesn't cover. So she can't be that conservative. In Pakistan, you're Iraqi. You haven't been to Iraq, but in Iraq, you might be Pakistani or that sort of thing. But you don't talk about these things about people categorizing you, imposing things on you. That's just not big for you.
I think I have learned to first adapt. I've been to 13 different schools, so in my lifetime, so I've definitely learned to adapt, but I think I've learned to also understand where biases come from and how to deal with them. So if I feel as though someone is not that happy to hear that I'm Muslim, right? I'll try to not necessarily lower how Muslim I am, but try to, see to show how similar we are to people. I remember when I was in Tajikistan and I don't have any Persian roots, but my best friend is Persian. I remember we were talking about it, and they were like, "Oh, you look Tajik, right?" And so I feel like no, when I go to a lot of places, a lot of times they think that I look like I'm from the place, so that kind of helps, you know. And I'm like, well, actually, I was like, you might have noticed, but in Iraq, we also have a lot of diversity, just like the Persian Empire or in Tajikistan and things like that. And so fostering these connections can really allow people to not think you're super foreign. So even if they do categorize them by kind of proving them wrong in this kind of almost soft approach way by saying I'm not actually as different. I am still what you think I am, right? I am still, for example, a Muslim. I am still, for example, if I go to the Middle East and I'm saying my dad is Iraqi, but my mom's Pakistani, they'll go, "Oh, you go by what your dad is, so you're fully Iraqi." I still am like, "Well, yeah, but I go to Pakistan a lot, right?" So they'll be like, "Oh, tell me about that." You know what I mean? And so and they'll be like, "I have a maid that's Pakistani." I'm like, "Wait, like where is she from in Pakistan?" Right? So finding these weird connections can really help people realize, okay, maybe they're not as different as I thought. You know? Yeah.
Is there anything you've ever felt barred from doing because of one of these categories?
Yes. Yes. I had a personal relationship with someone who was born and raised in Lebanon. He was Shia and quite conservative. And I remember I had, from the get-go, obviously told him I was Iraqi and Pakistani. And later on, he told me, after seeing my charity on the Instagram account for the nonprofit, he was like, "I don't like seeing you wear Indian clothes. It's kind of scary." And I was like, okay, well, first of all, they're not Indian, right? And they're Pakistani. There's a difference. I mean, there are a lot of similarities, but there is a difference. And the fact that he said he was kind of scared, I realized, okay, so he will only see me in the light that's Iraqi. He's like, he told me, he's like, in my eyes, you're Iraqi khalas, which means enough, right? And so I realized, okay, this is someone who's known me very personally. And it's come out, thank God, sooner than later. But I realized he'll never really see me for fully what I am. So sometimes I've had to accept, okay, not everyone's always gonna understand or accept you for your entirety, and so, another example of that was when I was in Jordan. The pay for people that are South Asian are incredibly low in comparison to Arabs or Europeans or Americans. So when my mom went to Jordan and I was going to school there and she was teaching, she told everyone she was Italian. And that she was not Pakistani. She's like, "Yeah, my name is Sherry," right? But, like, Malik is because I think my great-grandfather was Pakistani who moved to Italy, right? Because her pay would have been, like, super low that we wouldn't have been able to survive. Jordan's quite expensive. And so that's another example where sometimes you just have to adapt and, life is that's the way you survive. So I've learned that sometimes I need to accept my losses.
Okay, so we've mentioned places you've been: Philadelphia, Tajikistan, Jordan, Pakistan, not Iraq. Why haven't you been to Iraq?
I think it's to be quite frank, my tumultuous relationship with my father, he was, absent for a good portion when I was younger, busy with personal things in his life, familial, but also, deaths and his business and things like that. And so our relationship is amazing now. We talk like every day on the phone and he's become such a great mentor to me. But that being said, with the amount of deaths he's had with his mom and his father, he hasn't really felt the need to go to Iraq that often. But I've been telling him, I worked at the embassy of Iraq in DC, and I remember meeting people from the Iraq delegation at the United Nations in Algeria, at the conference in Algeria. And so I told him, I was like, I need to go, right? I have so much wonder and curiosity about this place, and I feel so connected to it. And yet I love to cook the food, and yet I've never been. So hopefully planning for a trip this summer. But if not, I think I might just have to go with my roommate who's Kurdish. So I'll have a different experience, but I'll still be there.
Okay. Oh, you mentioned the Iraqi embassy in Washington. You're working now at the embassy in London? Embassy of what?
The US.
Okay.
So, yeah.
So I almost want to go back to my first question. Where's home, at least in a political sense? I mean, if you had to represent a country, what would it be?
It would be the United States. I think the United States has a foothold in so many different countries, both, had positive results, but also have had very negative results. But I think it has so much potential to do so much good, and I've seen a lot of good. I did a State Department program called NISLY, which is National Security Language Initiative for Youth, where I went to Jordan with a group and we met someone from the US Embassy, and he was giving me these anecdotal stories of going to these villages in Jordan and things like that and helping these young kids, and I'm like, "That's what I wanna do." So I think that the US has so much opportunity to help, and I think that's why I wanna represent it, because I can help my countries and help the US, right? The mutual partnership.
Okay, now I want to ask you, based on that, an abstract question. Because again, there's two things that strike me about the way you talk. You want to do good, right? There's a really strong moral sense. And there's also a lot of empathy. Somebody looks at you funny and you want to know why. Do those ever come into conflict where you're, in a sense, empathizing with somebody that you're not quite sure is doing good?
Interesting question. I think yes. I've been raised on the idea that people aren't inherently bad, and most of the religions and philosophies that are interested in and that I've subscribed to, a lot of them don't believe that people are inherently evil. And so if someone is doing something that I find to be morally, like, eyebrow raised, right? I think to myself, why? Right? Like, what in their culture or upbringing makes them think this way? For example, to bring back to the Lebanese, guy that I was telling you about, I ended up talking to him about it. I was like, "That comment really bothered me." And I was like, first of all, they're not Indian, but, like, why would you say, like, why is it scary?" And he was like, he the way that he explained his upbringing, living in the culture, he's like, "I'm Lebanese, and my family has only ever lived in Lebanon, and we're from this part of the Shia community, and my family has connections to this," right? And they would be shocked if I told them I was talking to a Pakistani. And it's like, he's like he just painted this story of how isolating his culture can be and how judgmental, and I started to get that common ground then, even though from the beginning when I told my mom or I told my dad, my dad is a very understanding person. I mean, he was like, "Listen, if he's just someone who is racist or prejudiced, you just leave it at that. You don't need to argue, you don't argue or, cry or yell or say, why? You just, leave it at that." But I was like, "No, I'm genuinely curious, right? Because I thought he liked me for me." And so when I found this out and I started to get this common ground, I started to get more empathy for the why he believed what he believed. And I was like, "Okay, is there any way that you'd be open to it?" Because he loves being Shia, right? I was like, "Did you know that, like, one of the biggest Shia populations in the world is in Pakistan?" He had no idea. And I was like, "And they love to, like, help out." You know what I mean? And so we started creating a connection. He started becoming more and more interested. And so I think that sometimes you need to ask why, even when it's like, it seems like the most obviously, or someone's doing the most obviously wrong thing or saying the wrong thing.
I say, okay. First, this project in Pakistan, right? Educating girls, setting up a school.
Right.
That sounds good. It's not neutral. It's not necessarily going to be welcomed by everybody. So tell us a little bit more about that. I mean, you're coming in with specific ideas that some people may like and other people may not. What is it like as a young American woman coming in and trying to do a project that may sound beneficial from afar, but in a local context could be a little bit edgy or controversial?
Right. Again, going back to that understanding why it's controversial, understanding why it's taboo, and why do I think it's a good thing, right? I was like, why at the very basis do I think that students or young children or girls or boys, why do I think they need education? So I sat with myself a lot. I was like, how has education served me? Okay, from the very root of it, I saw how it served my mom and I saw how it empowered her. And it was literally the only way that she was able to raise me the way that she did and by herself was because of her education. She was able to teach, to make money, and things like that to support, our lives and to also just, teach me random things about the world that I probably wouldn't have learned from the classic curriculum I was learning in school. So that was a very understanding. It was like, okay, well, this is why education is important to me. When I went to Pakistan and I was, talking to families and fathers who really did not believe in it, I was like, okay, is education important to them? And I was like, a lot of the time, education was important to them, but it was important for their sons and the boys and the men and, not the girls, right? And so I was like, okay, but why? I started to realize there was a lot of fear or misunderstanding, fear that this daughter would, start to have her own way and leave the family nest or never come back. Or it was that, she would invest all this time and effort into school and then not get a job coming out of it. And so there's so many different fears or again, misunderstandings of what's gonna happen if they do have education, and so easing those kind of worries or tensions was the main thing that helped me kind of break through with some families. So that was the biggest thing. And then after that, of course, once they were like, okay, thumbs up for my daughter to go to school, for example, right? I said, okay, I don't want to come in here and say, this is what I learned from, suburban Pennsylvania. This is what we're going to teach here. I was like, what do you guys want to know? If you're afraid that your daughter is not going to get a job after, what's needed for the Pakistani job market? And they said, okay, they need to learn how to write on, type on computers, this type of idea of digital literacy. They need to know English and we want them to know Urdu. And so establishing these type of subjects that I knew that the students and the families would be interested in can really create this understanding that, okay, I'm here to serve you. You know what I mean? Rather than I'm, giving you this idea and you need to just subscribe to it.
Okay. My final question is, you sound like somebody who not only can get along with everybody, but does and works at it. And I'm interested in your experience the last couple of years in the United States when there's been a lot of polarization about domestic issues. You spend time in the Middle East. There's polarization about Middle Eastern issues, especially after October 7th. This was a time when people were not always very good at understanding where each other was coming from. Tell me what that was like for you.
A lot of tough conversations. It was a lot of tough conversations with people that were very charged on both sides of matter, whether that be with domestic issues or with tensions abroad and things like that. It was a lot of tough conversations because there was this barrier that I felt like I couldn't walk in with the idea I wanted to break it. I was like, maybe I need to climb over this barrier to see where they're coming from, and then we could work on slowly dismantling it. And so again, I think those conversations lacked a lot of empathy. And so when I felt like I was doing my most to give, background, for example, even something more recently, the US involvement with Iran. I have so many Persian friends that are, coming from different backgrounds. Some that are Zoroastrian, some that are Jewish, some that are Muslim, Shia, and Sunni, which is is a small minority of Iranians from the south. And I was talking to them, they all had extremely different views. Or some of my friends that were Arab were like, well, tell me why every, Iranian protest I see an Israeli flag. And I was like, well, my friends that are Iranian do not support the Israel or the US involving themselves with internal Iranian affairs, but some do, right? For, potentially because they feel, for example, Persian Jews and an example in LA feel very connected to, Israel and the idea of creating a oneness with the countries. So I think the lack of empathy was what stung the most, and I think it was the most difficult to overcome. But once you give, like, stories, you give headlines, you actually take the time to, like, talk to people and really hear them out, and they feel, okay, welcomed enough to, like, then, hear what you have to say, that's when I felt like I started making progress. And I learned a lot in myself. I changed a lot of my own opinions, hearing both sides of the conversation.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thanks very much for joining us from London, Belgium. Have a good rest of the time there, a good time in Zambia, and we're looking forward to having you rejoin us in Washington in the fall.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Dr. Rana and Aviva. It's nice to talk to you.